Hi, we continue in Genesis 22 today in verse 15, where the angel of Yahweh calls to Abraham a second time from heaven. If we'd ended the story with the last verse in verse 14, as you can see on the left side of the screen, one of the messages of the story would be, don't sacrifice your sons. God does not want you to sacrifice your sons. God is a God of chesed, of mercy and of kindness and of loyalty and of love, and has no desire for your sons. The people of desire for your sons in my name are kings and powerful people who lead them into war, as we saw in the last video, which leads to how that was understood long before modern biblical scholarship could look at it with the tools we're using by a young Jewish man named Leonard Cohen back in 1968 with his song, The Story of Isaac. And for copyright reasons, I can't play you the song here, but you can find it easily on YouTube or elsewhere. But I want to draw attention to the lyrics here, because on the left side of the screen, we see it as the story of Abraham and Isaac. But on the right side of the screen, we see it as the story of fathers sending their children to war. And so Leonard Cohen got this back in the 60s. But that's not the only understanding of it. Another one in the modern world from our friend and one of the great icon makers of our time, the Jesuit priest Bill McNichols, when he was a young man struggling with his sexuality, this image came to him as he was thinking of committing suicide for self-loathing out of discovering his gay identity. But now, many decades later, as an accomplished iconist and priest and a social justice activist, Bill no longer is carrying that sense of God with him. But this image he made showed his liberation when the angel of God came to him and said, no, don't take your own life. And in the modern world, we see other forms of expression of this beyond Renaissance art. I love this one by an artist named Sparrow, just from 2018, a street art in the city of Brussels in Belgium. And you can see it on the internet on many angles. And this one also from the same year from an artist named Yara Hockley in this sculpture format here as a statue looking up. So people have continued to grapple with the story, none more quickly than whoever the author was of these verses we're going to look at today, which by all accounts rings a different note to what we've seen earlier. And yet, in the structure we're seeing, it's part of this chiasm. We're going to be looking at this section here today, and without this, and if it ended here, there would be no chiasm here, and that would create a lack of symmetry with the chiasm here, which isn't itself a problem. Many times in text there's one chiasm and the whole text isn't a chiasm, but it would certainly create a different ending. So let's look more closely at this second half and see first what the problem is of why it's a disjunction from the first one and how it might fit in with the bigger picture of Genesis. So simply here in my note below, Westerman, writing back in the, many decades ago now, just simply calls it a later addition. And yet, as Wenham notes, without these verses, the test of Abraham is apparently purposeless. And he cites other scholars in agreement. But I would disagree, as I explained in the last video, and I won't go back to make that point here. As Grossman notes below, still arguing that the angel's message is integral to the wider story, yet comes here for strategic reasons. He says noting that there is nothing new about the content of the blessing, he says, the blessing's novelty lies in the caption, by myself I swear. This is the only time that Abraham has vowed something by God. In fact, this is God's only oath toward one of the forefathers. So that's certainly worth noting in itself. But the narrator's note here a second time, as Tribble noted many years ago, signals the start of the parallel conclusion, but perhaps it indicates a second thought or an afterthought. And that's what I'd like to suggest here. Whether we think of it as a second thought from later authors or a second thought from Yahweh, the first thought was, no, don't kill your son. I'm a God of mercy. I don't want you to be doing that. But perhaps the second thought, as we'll see played out in the divine soliloquy in verse 16, at least via the angel, although it's said now in the first person, even though it was an angel in verse 15, it's God directly in verse 16. As we see, perhaps it's God's further thought, but even though I didn't initially intend for you to think that your call was to sacrifice Isaac, the fact that you did and waited for me suggests perhaps a different kind of trust, that you, Abraham, knew Yahweh, would not ask you that. And so you trusted all the way to the very end, to when the angel interrupted the first time. Now, since Abraham says nothing and seems to have no emotional response whatsoever, at least from the voice of the narrator, we simply can't know if that's true. As many have said throughout the ages, that Abraham knew that God wouldn't take Isaac. He wasn't that kind of God, and yet he went through it to see what would happen. broken, or he simply made the wrong choice, as we saw in the last video. Either way, this message here is suggesting because you've done this and not withheld your son. Now we saw here in the previous one, it said, now I know you fear God since you have not withheld your son, your only son. So there was only one action there. Here there seem to be two actions, because you've not done this and have not withheld your son. So the done this, most scholars take as the substitute of the ram, because you've substituted the ram and yet not withheld your son. And the word here for withheld can also mean restrain, as we saw earlier. Notice that here it's your son, your only son, again repeating, not the one you love, still not including love within this mix. But the because here is an unusual word. It's only here in Genesis. The usual frequent word for because is key, but here we only see it here. And interestingly, it's connected to 1 Kings 3, the story of Solomon, which is important to look at. Let's look at that just briefly. So God said to Solomon, because you have asked this, which is for the knowledge of good and evil, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word, etc. And so there, in the Solomon story, which is certainly a religion of empire story as I've been presenting it, one that validates a king as having Yahweh's authority, there the divine vision suggests that Solomon also was put to a choice. Do I want the knowledge of good and evil, or do I want riches and power like most kings? But Genesis has already told us back in the Garden of Eden that the knowledge of good and evil is something exclusively to God, that it's prohibited from human beings precisely because human beings might imagine if they had it, they could rule in God's name, like the kings of all the empires around them have done throughout the centuries of the authorship of Genesis and the journey of the people behind the authorship of it. So the Solomonic echo of this little word because here suggests a similar choice that Solomon had to make and Abraham had to make, but perhaps in a different direction. Certainly the King's text is supporting Solomon's choice and doesn't know about the Genesis Garden of Eden story, which is almost certainly written much later, as we've been exploring, in the time of exile or in the time of Persian control of the province of Yehud after exile. We can't know that for sure, but this certainly seems to echo potentially into that. So from that perspective, because you have done the substituting of the ram and have not withheld your son, I will indeed bless you. And the indeed here is the doubled form here. You see it, bless you, yes, bless you. At the only time we see that, and as the Midrash notes, it's suggesting one blessing for Abraham and one for Isaac. But this is the only double blessing we see. And it includes some other forms of blessing that we need to look at and to see why this might be different than the first one. So let's go take a couple of steps back and look at the promises and responses chart that started in chapter 12, as you see there, and goes all the way through our scene right here. And although this is difficult to see on the screen, I've changed it around a little bit so you can see it by category here. So these are the kinds of promises that either God or Yahweh has given to Abraham, starting in chapter 2, verse 12. And I won't go through all of them now, except to note that the one we get down here, to possess the gate of your enemies, is only here. It will be echoed in 24:60, as we'll see in just a moment, but not by God. There it's Laban speaking to Rebekah as she heads off with Abraham's servant to go back and marry Isaac. So we only hear it here anywhere in Genesis as an expression of the divine category here. Another element, we hear the promise is your offspring will be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. But as many authors have noted, most recently Megan Warner, it's almost an exclusively militaristic image. And let's look at just a few examples, the ones that she notes there in the note below on the left. We can see those spread out here on the right. So from Joshua, Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see 4 examples, whether they're, quote, our troops, Israel's troops, as you see in the last example, or the troops of Midianites and Amalekites and Philistines, in other words, enemies along the way, all described as like the sand of the seashore in multitude. So when we return to our passage here, we recognize that there's a double image, both the promise of the sand of the seashore, like military, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, which is certainly a militaristic sounding image. And since Genesis has been anti-city ever since Cain's city, Enoch, back in chapter 4, and we've seen it throughout, that Abraham has avoided cities, or when he goes to cities, problems emerge, like we've seen when he went to Gerar and told Sarah to say that you're my sister. sister. Here, the idea that the promise of God in Genesis would be the possession of the gates of their enemies certainly rings contrary to the more pacifistic elements of Genesis. Even when Abraham engaged in a military battle in chapter 14, it was to rescue Lot, and we saw he absolutely refused to be remunerated from it, to suggest that he was beholden to a local king, and he went off once Lot was freed. And so everything about Abraham so far and the story behind him has suggested his goal is to stay away from cities and stay away from the militaristic problems that got Lot in so much trouble. And yet here it is. So we need to look a little more closely at how this piece fits in with the part of the story we've seen, so it doesn't just end on the usual note, yes, God is praising Abraham for being willing to offer his son. So let's look a little more closely at this. Make your offspring your seed, as we saw earlier. And notice this is still one last echo of the question we've been looking at in these 3 chapters, of whether Isaac is a function of Abraham's seed. He doesn't know whether Abimelech provided the seed or whether he himself provided the seed. And as far as we know, he's the only one of the characters, including Sarah and Yahweh, who doesn't know that Abimelech was not the father. But certainly here and now there's the promise for further seed that come from him. Numerous the stars of heaven, and again we'll see that in chapter 26, which reminds us of the parallels here. And so let's look at that piece now here. And Megan Warner and others have noted these 3 verses, these 3 short passages as parallels, and I've color-coded them so you can see the similarities and differences. There are many parallels in chapter 26, and we'll look at those more closely when we get there. But for this purpose, note that this is being expressed to Isaac here, to reside in this land, that's Abimelech's land, as an alien, and I will bless you and give these lands. Make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven, and give to your offspring these lands. Notice left out is the sand of the seashore, and your offspring will possess the gates of your enemies. Otherwise, it's similar. But they both end with a Deuteronomistic sounding, you have obeyed my voice, made even more Deuteronomistic from chapter 26's edition, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, which is the kind of phrase repeated over and over again. It's almost a signature of the Deuteronomic perspective that goes from Deuteronomy all the way through 2 Kings. And we noted, or maybe you didn't note, that all of these places where we saw the sand of the seashore as being a military image are from Deuteronomistic passages, which are to say texts between Deuteronomy and 2 Kings, as Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel are right after Deuteronomy and right before the books of Kings. As we look at these, we know that even though this sounds Deuteronomic here, it leaves out the militaristic imagery that we see here. In Exodus 32, which is certainly an insertion in the golden calf story, and maybe the golden calf story is itself an insertion in the Exodus story, as many scholars have argued, notice it's recalling this very specifically. Remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them. Notice this is appealing to God. By your own self, although it's only Abraham that God swears to by his own self, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and I will give you this land. So the descendants and the land, as we saw in these promises here, but not to possess the gates of your enemies. So this is the only time we're seeing that. So what's going on there? We need to look a little bit more closely at that. Let's look at the 3 words that are key in this phrase. Possess. The parallel is here in 2460, again, when Laban issues a similar blessing. And yet we should note there that it's coming from a Mesopotamian. They're from Laban, who's certainly not a Yahwist, and certainly not the kind of person that Abraham expects to be covenanting with. In fact, we'll see in the next round where Jacob really struggles with Laban for a whole generation because of the cultural differences as well as the generational differences. So the fact that this is echoing out of Laban's mouth is not a positive thing here. The word for gate is a normal word for gate, sha'ar, and it's used in chapter 19 for the gate of Sodom, as we saw. It'll be used in chapter 23 for the gate for the Hittites, where Abraham in the next scene will be negotiating for a burial place for Sarah, which will become a burial place for him as well. And so we're talking about people meeting at the city gate there to negotiate this land deal. But perhaps more ominously and perhaps more to the point are the echoes in chapter 34. And we've seen earlier, I won't bring them up now, you can go back in the previous videos and see some ways in which the previous chapters we've been looking at here, Genesis 20 to 22, have echoes into chapter 34, which is the horrible scene of where Dinah, the only daughter of Jacob, goes out and the prince of the city finds her and rapes her and then wants his father to get her as a wife. And a deal is made, but two of Jacob's sons come up with the plan to have them all circumcised first before they can share wives and share land. And while they're recovering from the circumcision, they slaughter them all. Let's look at the couple of verses here that echo the issue of gate here. So in 34:20 we see Hamor, who is the king of the city, and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying. So this is their attempt at the gate of the city to argue on behalf of the deal with these strangers. And it ends here with the echo of that. All who went out of the city gate heeded Hamor and his son Shechem. Every male was circumcised, and all who went out of the gate of the city. But then as the scene follows, you see Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came upon them unaware, killed all the males, and then slaughtered everybody, and plundered the whole place, taking their herds and donkeys and whatever is in the field, along with their wealth and all their wives. And when Jacob objects and said, "You brought trouble on me," literally, "you've made my name stink around here," their response is, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" And that presents the terrible situation there of what happens when you settle too soon. When we get to that story, we'll see that Jacob had given a vision by God that he should go back to the land where he began, but having struggled with Laban for so long, he settled and built a house near this town, and city things resulted. Kings take and king's sons take, and that's what we saw there. So the issue of our sister be treated like a whore echoes what we saw earlier in chapter 20 of Abimelech paying Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver for his sister Sarah, so that presumably the evil that he had done, which he didn't do, would be covered over. But it certainly makes her look like a whore, a high-paid one, but that she had sex with a king and he paid her husband, her brother, 1,000 pieces of silver for it. Certainly not a pretty scene for the first matriarch in the sequence in Genesis here. And it's not said out loud, and the Midrash actually, when it gets to the end of the story, speaks of Sarah as being a perfect person, although that's a certain glossy, rose-colored glasses view of this. So what we might take out of this is the image of the gates of their enemies is not projecting out what we see here, what we saw in the imagery that we just saw from the Deuteronomistic history of a militaristic perspective, but perhaps from looking ahead to chapter 34, when the town there becomes their possession, not by having a king, but simply by using circumcision and a little bit of deception as a weapon. And we'll see more in the Jacob story how people who don't have a king and don't necessarily have the power, certainly not the power of troops and iron chariots and swords and all those things, can use deception and other kinds of cleverness, as Jacob does against his brother Esau. So we'll see that perhaps what's being set up here is not an affirmation of the religion of empire, of a militaristic conquest, but of a Genesis-like use of deception to achieve similar goals. So we'll leave this pending and recognize that the question of that will take the rest of Genesis to try to answer, and I'll try to come back to it as we go. And the author's not over, the narrator's not over here yet. Excuse me, it's not the narrator speaking, it's God's voice speaking. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves. And we see the similar element there that's echoing from chapter 12, because you have obeyed my voice. And again, it's a different word for because. Neither of them are the normal word for because. The word here is Jacob. And we've seen how Yitzhak, meaning laughter, played out when Abraham and Sarah laughed before the child was born. And now Jacob plays out before Isaac and Rebekah are even together. It's used here in an unusual circumstance. As the lexicon notes, it can mean as a consequence, but it certainly is Yaakov. And it's only 26:5 elsewhere in Genesis. Here, is it overheard by Isaac? We'll hear it later. We don't know. My notes suggest it is, but we again don't know if Isaac's hearing the voice that Abraham is hearing here. And as I noted already, the phrase, obey my voice, is a Deuteronomistic theme. But as Megan Warner has shown in her book simply on Deuteronomistic influence in the book of Genesis, really this alone is not enough to determine that, even though we see in its echo here, it certainly is. But the other uses of hear voices are not to hear God's voice often. It's to hear Sarah's voice or the voice of your woman or others along the way. And so, again, that's another element we'll have to wait and see as we go. And so, after all that drama, our story ends on a note that suggests a further element of the story that we need to look at. It's easy just to stop right here, but let's not. So Abraham returned to his young men. Notice it doesn't say Isaac returned. It doesn't say the donkey's there either. And it doesn't say there's any conversation about where were you or what were you doing. And they arose, echoing the beginning of Abraham arising, and went together to Beersheba, where Hagar and Ishmael are. And at least in that region, as Brett notes below, the names of Hagar and Ishmael are mentioned nowhere in chapter 22, but the traces of their presence are everywhere, as we saw in all the parallels that we've been looking at. The reader is faced with a choice. Either we hear their voices or we read them with the exclusivist ideology of chapter 22 and ignore them. And by that he's referring to the fact that the divine voice several times refers to your only son, Isaac, even though we know that Ishmael's a son. So we hear they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. But the last thing we saw is that he was living among the Philistines for a number of days. And if we look at the map, we can remember that Gerar, where he was, and Beersheba are not far apart. But Hagar and Ishmael are in this region right here, and there seems to be no particular reason for him to go there other than something in his mind that suggests he might see Ishmael and Hagar. And with that image, we know that he's known all along that this voice that said, your only son, was not his only son, and perhaps he'd have some hope of seeing Ishmael again, which he will not, although Ishmael will see his father again when he comes with his brother Isaac to bury him. And so that's that powerful story. And curiously, the chapter ends with more children born to Abraham's brother, but we'll look at the details of that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.